Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My dearest brothers and sisters in Islam, welcome to the New Muslim Academy and another session from our series, General Reminders and Lessons about Islam. Previously, we spoke about the pillars of Islam, and then we spoke about the pillars of Iman and other similar sessions. Today, brothers and sisters in Islam, I want to take us back to the first pillar of Islam, and that is the pillar of faith. And not just faith, but faith in one God, and Him being the only one worthy of worship. No doubt that pillar also entails that the messenger is the messenger. But zooming in slightly into this point of God Almighty being the only one worthy of worship, this we know of in the Arabic language as Tawheed. Tawheed. And Tawheed is an Arabic term that refers to belief in God Almighty being one in His lordship. He's the only one who creates, who gives life, who gives death, who sustains. He's the provider, the only one who provides. He's the only one who protects ultimately, and the only one who can purely, excellently nurture us to perfection. And any other help that we get in life is because of His will and decree, God Almighty. So He's one in His lordship. He's also one in His worship. We only worship Him alone. In terms of worship of our heart, in terms of love and hope and fear, all of these manifestations are directed to only one God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is one in His worship. In terms of our physical worship, in terms of our financial worship, right? When we give charity, when we observe the salah, this ritual obligation that we know in the Arabic language as salah, or that which is loosely translated as prayer, this also is directed to one Allah. We don't intend anyone else or anyone else's pleasure when we worship God Almighty. We don't seek, the creation of goodwill, that people might consider us religious, people might consider us good because of our. We don't look for any of those worldly benefits, but we worship God Almighty alone. We worship Him seeking His pleasure alone. So He's one in His worship, and He's also one in His names and attributes, meaning God Almighty has unique names, unique attributes that are unique to Him, and He is one in those attributes, one in those names. Those attributes are not shared with anyone else from the creation of God Almighty. So this is ultimately Tawheed, and this is ultimately justice, my dearest brothers and sisters in Islam, because justice is about giving everything its due. And giving God Almighty His due is ensuring that we do not associate partners with Him. Associating partners with God Almighty in the Arabic language is known as shirk. Shirk. Shirk is polytheism, right? Polytheism, whereby you believe in God Almighty and then you ascribe partners to God Almighty. Polytheism exists in many shapes, in many forms, in many types, but this is from the means of polytheism, where you ascribe partners to God Almighty. This is the opposite of justice. This is oppression. For oppression is when you take the rights of somebody or something away from it. In this case, you're taking away God Almighty's rights from Him. You can't take away from God Almighty, but you're exhibiting in action, taking away God Almighty's rights from Him and affording it to another being, and raising that being to the level of a deity, albeit a false deity. This is shirk. This is polytheism. This is oppression. So Tawheed and the belief in one God and directing our worship to one God and believing that He's one in His names and attributes, this is from ultimate justice and giving God Almighty His due. This is the reality of the first pillar of Islam, or especially the first portion of the first pillar, which states that there is no God worthy of worship besides one Allah. I leave you with this reminder, and until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.